And we're recording. Welcome back to another episode of Things That First Year Writers Need to Hear. Today, I have with me Kenny Fountain, Associate Professor of English and Director of Writing Across the Curriculum at University of Virginia. Kenny has done quite a bit of research on the rhetoric of science, technical communication, among lots of other stuff. And importantly for this discussion, well, the different writing practices that take place in different academic disciplines. And I want to get into a discussion with him today about how to do longer writing projects, and particularly what it takes to learn how to do longer writing projects. While I was at UVA, Kenny was the one to teach the PhD students in my cohort how to teach first-year writers, and he also happens to have been my thesis advisor, which he was very gracious to have suffered through. This would have been in the 2018-2019 school year. And while working with him in this capacity, I learned a great deal about the writing process, especially for longer projects. And those lessons have, at least I think, made me a significantly more efficient writer ever since. So as I said, I want to talk with you today, Kenny, about those lessons that I think I learned during that. And not just what those lessons are, but also how to learn them, how to acquire those lessons in some sense. In all of this sort of framed in a way that might be useful for first-year writers or anyone else who wants to hear. But I think I'll start with this. How you doing, Kenny?
Very well, very well. Thanks for giving me the opportunity.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time. So as I said before we started, I want to really kick off by just saying, can we go briefly over what you remember from working with me on my thesis, and any advice and kind of guidance you were giving me? And I'd be really interested to hear some of the reasoning behind that advice. So I don't know exactly what you remember. I probably remember it better than you do because it was like a bigger thing for me, but do you have any thoughts at this point, or would you prefer me to do a little bit of recollection?
Yeah, I mean, it might be helpful to do a little recollection. I can say generally, one of the things that I always try to get students thinking about with a longer project is that writing in itself is a form of distributed cognition. So it isn't really just our mind and a pencil and the page, or our mind and the blank page, blank computer screen in one setting. It's actually thinking about it in the shower, or walking down the street, or reading something, or talking with somebody. But I want students to think about, and I mean this for undergraduates, graduate students, for me and my own work, to remember that it takes a lot of pieces of paper, a lot of notes, and time to actually get the kind of writing done you want to get done, because our memory, our working memory, is actually very, very limited. So in general, I'll say one of the things I try to get students to do is figure out ways to break up that process. Even for something that is 4 pages long, figuring out ways to break up that process. But yeah, let's talk a little bit about
Well, that's very similar. So it's funny because what you just said about like even do it for a 4-page thing. That's kind of what I learned. So I don't think I've talked about this before, but the thesis that I wrote with under your supervision was, if I can remember the exact title, it was called "Learning to Learn to Write: Adapting the Principles and Practices of Cognitive Behavioral Therapy into First-Year Writing Curricula." And I think I probably want to do my own little spiel about that on one of these videos at some point. But the point is, I was trying to take the ideas of cognitive behavioral therapy, which required learning about this whole section of stuff over here, this whole subject, and then also tackling all the current threads of relevant research in composition studies on the other hand. And that meant there was a lot of ground to cover and then a lot of stuff to synthesize. And from the very beginning, you were very good about saying, okay, we started in the fall and we said, okay, this fall is about the literature review. It's about gathering information on your sources and writing like the first half of the thing. Next semester, we're going to like extrapolate off of that and put that into action. But this semester is about this. That's all we're doing. And then we break that up further and we say, okay, well, this like next little chunk of time, which we didn't specify so much, but might be a month, is like, we're going to tackle this thread. And maybe that thread was the study of knowledge transfer in composition studies. And we would say that, okay, that's like our month's work. And then each week, it was like, you would hand me, okay, these three sources. I want you to read these three sources, and I want you to write up essentially a little annotated bibliography entry on them. What is it saying, and why might it be useful for your research? And that's all you're doing for the week. Like 150-ish words on a source for three sources, and that's a week's work. And like suddenly that looks a lot more manageable. And it's the just that mindset of first things first, break it up into tasks and like a hierarchy of tasks, and then proceed with one thing at a time. That has absolutely helped me write things like 4-page papers, not just a thesis. And I don't know. I mean, what do you have any specific thoughts at this point, or?
Yeah. It's nice to hear that that helped because my approach isn't something that everybody wants, right? So
Mhm.
I've worked with students in their dissertations, advised dissertations, and some students sometimes can find it a little hard to work with me, or we have to figure out the system. Because I prefer to be very involved, always with the possibility of pushing back and somebody saying no, and you would do that. You'd be like, well, I think it'd be better for me if I started on this
Mhm.
before that. And that kind of negotiation was really important because that also helped me see uh, what was working for you. If you're studying this and I want you to go over here, but you're like, no, I want to go over here, then part of my job is to help you sort of explain to me why you want to go over here and focus on this next, and then sort of let you do it. So I prefer a process that I'm a bit more hands on. Um, some of this is because I learn along the way with you. So if I said, do your literature review and we'll meet at the end of the semester, I think that's not a problem. People can totally do that, right? But for me, I selfishly don't learn along with you. I don't get to see how your thinking unfolds. I don't get to find out the new cool stuff that you're excited about the day we meet, right? I just get this paper at the end. So there are a lot of very selfish reasons for why I structure. I have students that I work with structure longer projects in the way that I have them structure it. Um, but it's also because it I still find it very overwhelming to say I'm going to write an 8,000 or 10,000 word chapter or article. And I've been doing this for a while. I still find that overwhelming. You know what I mean? So I'm like, okay, I've got a lot going on today. I've got this meeting. I've got this thing. I've got this thing. What can I do? Well, I know I don't know enough right now about what people are saying about X. So let's spend a little time there on some of that lit review stuff and think about what I need
Mhm.
to know to get myself up to speed. So I find that kind of breaking things up into chunks, into something that feels manageable, it's very helpful for me not to be overwhelmed. Um, Particularly because when you don't have someone over you saying you got to finish the seminar paper at the end of the semester or this paper is due in 3 weeks, if you don't figure out a process that allows you to break it up, you simply won't do it. other
Mm.
things in life get in the way. So one of the things I'm trying to do, or hopefully with both uh, first year writing students as well as advanced students, is help them figure out their practices of sort of chunking and compartmentalizing and breaking it down so that they can figure out a way to keep doing that when their life and schedules become a lot crazier and a lot more hectic.
That's yeah, no, that's it did work for me. So thank you. Um, but in that, it's interesting to me because well, here's the question I'm leading up to, first of all, which is how do you recognize what you're really trying to do when you sit down to write?
Ah,
And I'll backfill that question with a small anecdote borrowed from an undergraduate professor of mine, who's actually this is Professor Margaret Dixon, whose episode is also in this podcast, and she talked about her husband writing his dissertation, and the way she described it was um, every night when he went to work on his dissertation, he would sit down to write his dissertation, and so every night he was disappointed when he had not, in fact, written his dissertation. And it's not like if you had asked him, or do you plan to finish tonight? Obviously, he would have said no. Of course not. There's like however much more work to do. But my point is that it's easy to pay lip service to the idea that you should break things up, but you can even set out the plan. It seems to me, but that doesn't mean that you're going to act like you believe that you're doing just this one annotated bibliography entry when you sit down to write. Because I had to tell myself this, and I think it was easy to tell myself this partly because I was working with you, and you, I think your affect and your sort of demeanor spoke that you actually believed that that was the task, as opposed to you weren't just saying it or paying lip service to it. I think it also had to do with the fact that the subject of my research was, dispositions and exactly this sort of thing. So it was probably maybe more aware of that. Um, but it's one thing we can sit here and we can tell students that they need to break things up, and then they'll go, "That sounds great," and then they'll write out a plan, and then they'll sit down and they'll snap right back into their old habits. And I don't know how to fix that problem.
oh my God, you can't.
Oh, well, okay,
I
we're
still
done. There we go.
I still do it, right? So there
Me
is a
too.
difference between uh so there are things that so I have to, even for myself, force myself to engage with certain kind of practices that I know will work, even when I don't want to. So the one of the things that's really hard about writing for me is I want to sit down and write it. I am that person who wants to write the dissertation at night. I want to sit down and I want to write it. That's what I want to do. Cat's driving me crazy. But I know intellectually I cannot do that, right? But that doesn't stop me from being frustrated to say, I've only got 8 weeks and I need to try to finish this article in 8 weeks. And oh God, I'm not making any progress. And, what is helpful for me is to think about whatever my assignment is, right? So we have lofty goals. I want to contribute to knowledge. I want to publish this in this venue, blah, 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 all that stuff. All that stuff's cool, right? But for most of what I'm working on academic writing, right? So my assignment is to try to finish a book chapter or try to finish a draft of a book chapter or a draft of an article. So I try to think of it according to those same kind of assignment parameters. I know there's got to be, I know that genre I'm working in, right? So I know there's got to be some kind of lit review. It doesn't have to be super boring, but it's got to be there. I know I got to have some kind of analysis section in each chapter. I know that I got to have some kind of so what that for me contributes to my field in some way. I know I got to have these things. I also know that when I sit down, I don't know what those are yet. And that's the most frustrating thing, right? You have to write to get the ideas. And I don't want to do that. I want to already have my ideas and then write to express them. So that's one of the like struggles I have, that I have to make myself do a kind of regimented process, right? Because I do get frustrated when I don't know what I want to say when I sit down. But I find the more I think of the steps and the actual finished product itself as like a series of components. Uh, there's going to be a lit review section, so I got to make sure I draft it, and I may have to edit it, but I know what I need to do this lit review section. So that's the component I'm going to work on. Ooh, but if really good ideas come while I'm doing it, I got another page open, and so I'm writing stuff down. Uh, so for me, it is thinking of what I'm doing as not super lofty. I'm trying to write 8,000 to 10,000 word chapter or article. And I'm trying to do those sections that I have to have. I don't want to do them in a way that's terrible and boring, but I need that kind of to think of building these components in order to help me stick and get anything done. If not, it's so overwhelming, or I make an excuse.
So let me see if I can paraphrase a bit just to make sure that I understand you. It it sounds to me like something what's happening is that the action, like the large task, like for me writing a thesis, you concretize that as much as possible, and you try to make that the object of your thinking when you're thinking on the global scale. But then just hearing you talk also seems to me that one of the cognitive functions that helps you maintain a broken up writing process is I'm I hate to use the word reify because I don't think it's quite the right word, but essentially reifying the smaller tasks into very real things. So that it's not like this is a part of a whole. It's more like this is a thing unto itself.
Yeah.
This is sufficient. This is a good day's work. I can work on this task unto itself. And there's something about thinking about the component task not as a component but as a task unto itself that makes it easier to address as such. Is that okay?
Yes. And the thing you say, this is sufficient. And that's the hard, right? That's all the emotional stuff you got to do. 'Cause you're like,
Yeah.
"I'm not good enough. I want to make more progress. I was supposed to get 5 pages done, not three." Like on all, I'm making a mocking tone, all that stuff you feel, right?
Hmm.
But figuring out that internal dialogue with yourself of like, okay, this is sufficient. I'm working towards something that's much more manageable, uh, and I'm moving in that direction. For me, I've even found words like progress not very helpful because they can turn into very critical. They can be flipped over to self-critical stuff. You're not making enough progress. Well, what is progress? That's when I'm like, okay, no. Uh, for example, I'm collaborating in the early stages of collaborating on an article with a colleague of mine who's at the University of Texas at Austin. So we had our first Zoom meeting to sort of hash it out. Afterwards, I wrote for like an hour. Bad. They were notes.
Right.
But if I had thought about progress, I would have been like, well, are these ready to share with him? Do they make sense? Is
Getting
he
ahead of
going to
yourself.
understand them? Right? I was like, no.
Yeah.
We each had some questions, preliminary questions we need to figure out before we can move forward. Here was my work in trying to understand those questions. And so I try to think of it as like sufficient work, if that makes sense.
So perhaps I mean, I guess this is the kind of thing that I'll be thinking about as I go on to dissertation work and everything, because this is probably the sort of thing that I'll want to look into. But it's a conscious decision that perhaps becomes something of a habit, or at least there seems to be some, even if you're not, even if you don't have a habit to break things up like that, you at least have a habit of mind that reminds you that you need to break it up.
Yes.
So there's like a flag that goes up automatically, which is probably planted there in advance by probably years of consciously trying to remind yourself. And I mean, for me, I have to like I'm looking at my schedule for this week today, right above me. And what I've done and what I've started doing largely in response to the writing process that we went through in my thesis is I've got like, what else do I have to do today? So I have to read chapters 9 and 10 of Gilbert Ryle's The Concept of Mind. I have to find a church to attend on Sunday. I have to draft a letter of recommendation for one of my students. I have you today, and I might get to it, I might not, but I have to put up a few things on the Canvas site for my students, and that's it. That's Tuesday Fane's work. Wednesday Fane gets to worry about prepping class for Thursday and doing this other reading and doing this other thing. But when I look at it just visually, Tuesday's a column, Wednesday's a column, and I'm honing in on just Tuesday. And I'll be honest, I kind of lost the thread from where I started that. But
I mean,
is that the kind of thinking you're talking
yeah,
about?
yeah. What you're doing there is you're breaking things down. You're allowing yourself to also create a kind of checklist, whether or not you actually literally check it off, right? So there is, I find that a lot of what I have to do is as you say, I'm trying to, even if something isn't a habit, I'm trying to habituate myself to it. I'm trying to figure out a way to make it a habit, not in a like forcey way, right? Because if it's not going to work, it's not, you got to revise it. But there is a lot of self talk around all of our writing, right? You know that that was part of what your thesis is looking at, right? It's very easy for that self talk to be critical when we
Mm.
start thinking about progress and is it good enough and are they going to judge it and all that stuff. So it's very easy for all the self talk to be very limiting. So for me, I have to try to uh, introduce, remind myself of forms of self talk that don't get in the way.
Mm.
So it doesn't matter whether they're good or bad or growth mindset or not. All that's cool. All that's great. But for me, I'm like, my bar is low. I just want some self talk that isn't going to get in the way. So when I think about things like, did I make a lot of progress? I'm trying to never ask myself that. I'm saying, okay, I had thought ahead of time that there were certain things I wanted to do. Like I told myself after the meeting with him, I was like, I'll probably take some time to write some notes. I was thinking 30 minutes of notes, couple sentences, whatever. I wrote a couple of pages. So I was like, okay, I did what I assigned myself to do. And I know that that's going to contribute. Tomorrow, a little bit later this evening, pardon me, I've got another task I want to do. And so for me, if I keep these as tasks that I have to do, um, then it's about doing those tasks um, in a sufficient way to kind of keep me on track. I used to block off time and say, I'm going to write for 3 hours today. And
Hmm.
for me personally, that was the best way to waste 3 hours. That was the best way to waste
Ah!
3 hours. Because I wouldn't, if I didn't think about, okay, I'm going to write for 3 hours, but I'm not going to write for 3 hours. I'm going to work on my lit review section. I'm going to return to my analysis of whatever my sort of data is, right? I'm going to return to that. And I'm not just going to analyze it and take notes, but I'm going to try to analyze it and take notes and try to start forming maybe bad sentences and bad paragraphs about what I'm finding. If I made myself break it down into components based on the work that I knew needed to be done, then my time wasn't unstructured.
Mhm.
For me, that unstructured time is very hard to get anything done. Um, yeah.
It's interesting. So I'm looking at again, looking at my schedule, and I have, like, next to, like, a reading, I have 60 minutes. Next to another thing, I have 30 minutes. But those aren't and this is kind of what I've started to try to do with myself. Those aren't time allotments, they're time limits. I'm
Mm.
trying to I'm trying, rather than say I'm gonna sit down and do this for 60 minutes, I'm gonna say, "I'm gonna sit down and I have 60 minutes to do this." And what ends up happening, of course, is that it takes longer, but it keeps me on task. And also, it makes the thing much easier to look at because I'm saying, "Oh, I'm only doing that for 60 minutes," right? Um, but that's, it seems, it makes me think that part of what makes this possible from just a psychological perspective is thinking of things as tasks rather than things. Like, this partakes of a theory that I've been batting around in my own head about how to assign work to students. And as I figure it, there are a few different ways you can assign work to students. You can tell them to make a noun, like make a thing, write a comparative analysis essay, or you can tell them to do an action, like compare these two works and da 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 da. And I think it's much easier to just intuitively. I think it's easier to understand the second one. I think it's hard if I tell you to write a comparative analysis essay. It's like the first question you have, even if you don't really articulate it, is okay. Well, what does that mean that I do? And the way you're talking about it sounds like you're not just making these tasks like real tasks unto themselves, but you're making them tasks, not things, right? It's a task that you do, not a thing that you make or a thing that is there in your schedule. It's like, this is the action I'm going to take to accomplish this goal. It's like it's implicit marching orders in some
Yeah.
sense. That, am I getting that right? I don't want to
Yeah,
be putting words
absolutely. That's absolutely what I think. Um,
in.
but it's also something that I don't think so when I was working on my dissertation, I figured out how to do it because there was a time limit. I'd
Yeah,
been offered a job at Case Western Reserve, and if I did not finish my dissertation and defend it, I would not get that job, right? So there was all kind of motivation to do all kinds of crazy things to get it done. Um, then when I had my job at Case Western Reserve and was trying to finish a book and a couple other publications, I realized I couldn't just throw everything else away the way I could as a PhD student. I'm like, bye, whatever, 3 months, you won't see me. I got to do this. I was like, no, I've got to uh, juggle all these other things. And it wasn't until honestly, I was almost finished with my book, the first draft, that I realized, oh, I need to do processes and not try to make things. I need to not make a chapter. I need to not finish my chapter even because that was like making a thing, right?
yeah.
I
That's only
need
disguised as an action.
Yeah, right? I needed to be like, okay, work on your lit review section. Okay, you have 3 sections where you wanna explain the 3 things you think are going on in this moment. So, work on those, articulate what those 3 things are. You say you find 3 things that people are doing. Okay, articulate those 3 things. Uh, I found, just as you say, thinking of these as actions. So I try to, in my assignment sheets, from first year all the way to PhD level, the very first thing I'll put is the purpose of the assignment. Because often that's the action. Like the purpose of this assignment is for you to, in my class that I taught in the fall was on propaganda and conspiracy theories. So they had to do a group project, and the purpose of that was for them to analyze a contemporary instance of either propaganda or a conspiracy theory, make sense of it through the lens of the text we had been reading this semester. And it was write a blank page paper that has an analysis section, but I did that part first. And then I had like my what I often call my task or my process steps that are like, okay, it's got to have this, got to have a little bit of a lit review, you got to have a little bit of this. But even there, I try to make those into verbs, like
Hmm.
review the relevant literature specific to that type of conspiracy theory. Um, Collect examples of that conspiracy theory. It can be memes, it can be web documents, but it's like do the stuff. Um, I find that even for advanced undergraduate classes, so I do it my first years, third years, fourth years, I try to give them uh, steps of actions
Hmm.
they need to complete in order to complete the assignment. And if you just change the grammar of those actions, many times it will be sections of the paper.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. That's the thing is that, and this is going back to the thesis, is that if you set out as we did, you're doing this week. You're reviewing these three articles. Then you're reviewing these three articles. And what ends up happening is that what you're doing, those actions translate into sections in the paper. And that happened almost one to one. There was obviously, you know, friction and things that we needed to sort out, but no process is perfect. But there were many of those little things that I wrote up for, our weekly assignments that just got lifted and placed back right into the thesis. And that's the thing is that you break the deliverable down into things that you need to accomplish, and then you think about them as tasks, not things. That's very interesting. That's very. Here's So you said you figured this, or you said that you started to think about this, or at least some of it coalesced when you were working on your dissertation under a time limit.
Well, I honestly, I have no idea what I did when I was working on my dissertation. I
Right.
really don't. It was such a blur. I had 3 months. I was fortunate enough to get a fellowship where I didn't have to teach, that semester, and it allowed me to finish my dissertation a year early. I was supposed to have 5 years of funding, but I finished it in 4. And that was kind of the understanding of the fellowship after I got it. They're like, "Oh, by the way, you need to finish this year. It'll make us look bad." I was like, "Oh, okay. I'll finish." Uh, you know, going on, like, applying for jobs and all that stuff. But it came a certain point, I think it was like February, end of February, I was like, "Okay, I got a job. They want me to start, I gotta finish this dissertation. They want me to have everything in hand by, like, the end of July. Okay, you gotta finish this dissertation." So, it was in many ways such a blur. I already had a bad draft of each chapter going that one of the problems was it was such a crunch that I actually didn't learn or have time to make sense of what I was doing that worked. So this is sometimes the case with the dissertation. It's big and you're trying to get it done, and you often don't take the time to reflect on what's working for you because you're just trying to get it done, right? You're about to lose your funding. It wasn't until the book that I realized, like, okay, I have to teach 2 classes. I'm on this committee. Oh man, I got some grad students. Okay, you got to have some book time because if you don't finish that book, you're going to get fired, right? So for me, that was what the job requirements were, right? So I first just started doing it in all the ways that were not sufficient for me, which was write a chapter, write a chapter. Why aren't you finished the chapter? Why haven't you finished the chapter? Why haven't you finished the chapter? And then I started just by schedule having to say, okay, you're going to work on your lit review section here. Okay, sometimes it would be like, okay, you still don't know what you want to say. How does what you want to say relate to these particular theories from embodied cognition, which is a lot of what I was using? And that ended up being like a little lit review section, right? But I realized by accident that when I told myself, if I made them intellectual questions, if I made them, well, what do I mean when I say that? Well,
Mm.
how does this person relate to this person? The end result was always writing that out, bad drafts of what this person meant to this person, or how does what I'm saying relate to what that person's saying. So I backed into this idea of turning it into actions and not just objects. But at a certain point, I started realizing
That's
tweaks
what you
and
were
things.
doing.
Yeah, and it was working only in the fact that uh, um, I was getting things done. Uh, and so my dissertation, in many ways, didn't prepare me for it. It was a very good colleague of mine who is a cognitive scientist. He's also a rhetorician, Todd Oakley, said something in passing. He was my colleague, Case Western Reserve. And he said, yeah, you just have to think of it as like you're making little widgets. And I was like, huh. And at first I was like, oh, that's terrible. Like making little widgets. Like it didn't seem grand. It didn't seem exciting. It
Didn't
didn't
seem
like,
meaningful and
yeah,
inspired.
not pushing forward knowledge and all that obnoxious stuff, right? I'm just making widgets. Ugh. But then I started realizing, like, oh, and he's very productive. He teaches, it's a very good teacher. He publishes quite a bit, does guest speaking gigs, right? He was the chair of his department for a while. And I was like, oh, and he's very involved with his family. And I was like, oh, his idea of making widgets was just break it up, uh, do parts at a time. My version of the widget was actions. What's the next action that needs to be accomplished? Okay, well, you need to accomplish that action. Um, and then there does come a point where you got lots of writing. And again, one nice thing again about being in a first year class, right? Or even as a college student, often you have an assignment sheet that tells you what you need to do. At the end of this, it's got to be a 5-page paper. It's got to analyze a short story. So you've got an object. Somebody's telling you what that object needs to look like. You don't need to worry about that object yet. You need to focus on the actions that will get some writing done so that you can craft that writing into whatever that object is.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, I think something you mentioned in there along the way was that, while you're doing the work, it's hard to reflect on the process that you're using. And this is something that I've written a little bit about on my blog, and I'm hoping that I can get a video up on it at this point. But the real one of the troubles is that you only have one work in memory, and if it's preoccupied with this stressful, unproductive task, then what part of you is going to be able to step back and reflect on the fact that the process is unproductive? And I think this is where as we were saying, that you have to have that, there has to be an instinct that sends up a flag. Right? It doesn't have to be an instinct to break things down in the part, but it has to be an instinct that notifies you when something's going wrong. And that's really difficult. It's difficult to
Yeah,
inculcate that in yourself.
I
You know?
it is. For me, it is the periodic check-in of how's it going and what seems to be working. So one of the things last night even that I did after chatting with Josh, I wrote for a while and I just wrote and I wrote and I wrote and I started like getting out sources, right? And being like, okay, it's this person's idea and this person's idea. Um, and then this morning I couldn't sleep. So I woke up and I was like, okay, I got a few things. So I wrote and I wrote. And then later on in the day during lunch, I was like, okay, that felt useful. What did I do there? And one of the things I did was I really wanted to write and I didn't put it off. I was like, I'm tired. I just want to sleep. But I was like, you can't sleep because this is running through your head. So get it out of your head. I think it's a lot of just periodic check ins. How's it going? Uh, and what's working? And sometimes those periodic check-ins are really good because sometimes the periodic check-in is how's it going? And it's like, I am so stressed out about this. Oh my God, this is stressing me out. I'm so stressed out. I
Hmm.
have so much to do. I got so many things. I'm so behind. And then you just have to like, it's like a lot of the mindfulness training, right? You just have to acknowledge that that's how you feel. And you just have to be like, oh, look, I feel that anxiety again. And try to be like, huh, okay, what do I know I can do? What in the past has helped me when I feel anxious, right?
Right.
So I think of the usually sentences. Usually, when I'm super stressed out because I feel like I haven't made progress, what helps me is to just make sure I schedule some time, do a little bit of free writing, get myself back on whatever the next task was supposed to be. So for me, it is managing a lot of the stress, a lot of the mild anxiety about these things by periodically checking in and saying, well, what normally works here? Well, for me, what normally works is acknowledge how terrible this is, or how stressed I am, or how much I hated that meeting, or whatever's going on. And then say, okay, you got to give yourself some free writing time where you just throw up on the page and then get back, and usually about the topic, right? And it can be questions. I still don't understand this. I still don't know how these things relate. All that is super productive time, because if you're not just producing 5 pages, but you're trying to answer a question or you're trying to come to grips with something,
Yep.
all that free writing is part of you coming to grips with it.
Yeah.
But for me, it's like I like when it goes well later on, huh? What was working? What was I doing? How did that go? And I try to uh, once a week. Don't do it on Sunday. Uh, Sunday's a tough day for us, right? Sunday's at the beginning of the week. Sunday's the moment where you feel like if you're going to feel you wasted your weekend, if you're going to feel you didn't get things accomplished, Sunday's the day to feel that. So do it like on Friday and say, well, how'd it go this week? What happened? Uh, on that one project I have to do. What did I do? Okay, where am I on it? Okay, okay. Another little simple thing that came from, I think, Flower and Hayes way back in the day was do not work to the point of imaginative exhaustion, is what I call it.
Yeah.
You got to know your next steps. So you got to stop when you're like, okay, and when I come back, I'll work on that really bad introduction.
That's very similar. I think it was Hemingway. I could be wrong, but I think it was Hemingway who said, you know, never when you get to the end of a period of writing, you shouldn't finish your last thought, because then you know what you're going to pick up with when you start again.
Yeah.
But if you have to, you know, if you have to pick it all back up again and put it all together when you start and have to figure out all over again what you're doing, that's a recipe for really not wanting to do it again.
Yeah, because you've taken away whatever little roadmap you could have had.
Mm.
Now, when I sat down, I'll sometimes just have a note, and I have like a research notebook. This is my work notebook, but I have a research notebook somewhere. Uh, and as I'm typing out everything, right, I will be like, okay, the date, um, and other things that need to come along next. And sometimes this ends up being writing about the actual topic, right? But it also tells me, like, okay, uh, you got to finish answering these questions. There's 3 articles that you know you need to read and come to grips with. So put that down on the list of the next things to do. But I make sure that I have a roadmap for where I want to go next, because then that helps me pick back up where I left off. Um,
Well, the other thing I try to impress upon my students, or at least when I have time to talk to them about it, is that doing this sort of planning removes about 50% of the stress that's associated with all your work.
oh
And
yeah,
I think it's because most of the stress, or at least a significant amount of the stress that comes from your work, doesn't actually come from your work. It comes from not knowing what your work is and not knowing what you're going to do about it. It's the uncertainty that adds this whole other layer of stress, and you can wipe that out by setting out a plan. And once you do that, it's you've got just as much work, but half as much stress about it, and you're actually going to get it done. And
mm,
it's just like uh, it's one of those. Speaking directly to students right now. This is one of those things that like you'll hear me, you'll hear Kenny, you'll hear your teachers give you this advice, and it will sound like something that, like on a lip service level, you should do, but you know that when you get back to your dorm, you're not actually going to do it. Try it for 1 week. 1 week, just and you can do this in like 20 or 30 minutes. Like schedule yourself this Friday or this Saturday, 30 minutes when you sit down and you just, you pull up like a Google spreadsheet or you can just do it out by hand and you say, okay, Monday, Wednesday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Wednesday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, next week. Gather all your syllabi together, figure out, okay, what do I have to do this next week in this class? When is it due? And then figure out, okay, well, when do I want to do it in the week? And just write it in those days. And then what you want to be able to do is you want to be able to look at that schedule you've written out and not be terrified about any one of the days. You want to look at the week and say, okay, I would like to have that week. And do that, like, just do like 30 minutes of that this weekend and see how that next week goes. And if it doesn't go well and nothing happens, then fine. Then, you got to do what works for you.
But it's also in relation to that, doing those lists is also a way to, for most of us, unstructured time when you have a lot of things to do, a lot of homework, a lot of reading, a lot of assignments, a lot of studying is not helpful. So that task making can be really helpful. What it also ends up doing is you do these tasks or lists or whatever it is, right? You also end up goal setting. So you get a goal accomplished. If part of what you had to do was, I have to read for my next class and be prepared to know enough about it to talk in class. So this is the thing I do. I talk with my students as well. Like, your homework is not just to read in class. Your homework is to read the chapter for homework, to jot down or be able to walk away with what the chapter is about in your notes. It can be ugly. And any places you do not understand. Maybe a couple places where it connects to something else you've talked about in the class. That helps you use your reading time, taking notes on what you read and reviewing those notes later is more useful for your processing and your long-term memory than reading something twice, based on empirical research from education psychology. So if I say I have to read for class, but reading for class means make sure I understand it. What's the main point? If there's something I don't understand, at least list out a question. And if there's one thing that connects it to something else, take some notes on that. This also then becomes part of not just your task of doing the reading, but you're working on your comprehension. You're working on discussion questions because the teacher's going to be like, something you didn't understand. You can say, hey, or the teacher's going to be like, what is this essay about? And you'll be like, hey. The teacher's like, well, how does it connect to something else you read? And you'll have an answer to that. But these breaking things up into tasks or to-do lists even also is a way to take a big task, break it up, and it sets little goals for yourself that are very, very accomplishable. And then if you do one of those, boom, then you've actually accomplished that goal. It sounds so silly and so easy, right? But
it's what all the productive people do.
Yeah. And it's what a lot of students do. A lot of students over the years, I did not do this when I was a college student, let's be clear. But in teaching and talking with students, a lot of the students that manage their stress the most, or better manage their stress, let's say, break things up into smaller goals and work toward those goals. They do periodic check-ins of how it's going. If they need to adjust the process, they adjust the process. If you need to move things on your to-do list around, that's fine, right? Because you still know what you need to do. So you reverse the order for some reason, but you still got those things on the list. So taking a little bit of planning to think about what's next and accomplishing those does a lot to help you manage your stress.
It's night and day. Like, again, speaking from a bit of experience here, this is something that I've started doing since I came to IU, and it was based on what we did at in the thesis work, and it gotta say, this is a cakewalk now. I mean, it's not that the work isn't hard. It's just that despite the fact that I'm locked in my room due to coronavirus all the time, I'm actually doing all right. At least the work is not a huge stressor. So can confirm it does work. Um, but yeah, I hate to do it, but I know you've got to go soon, so I figure we should probably start to wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy if there's another sort of question or
Well, I mean, I had all sorts. I wanted to get into the rhetoric of science and see if any of that had anything, because I know that's your thing. But good lord, Kenny, there's just so much that I would love to just sit down for hours and talk to you about. But I think we gotta go. So I will close out with this, which is just sort of to bring it full circle. Kind of the same implicit question from the beginning. If you had a platform, hypothetically speaking, where you could talk to a bunch of first year writers about what they need to know, what would you want to close things out by saying to them?
I would say, um, remember that writing is an activity that you need to distribute across time and across notebooks or computers or whatever it is, right? So take notes. Uh, there's a lot going on in our mental space. So note taking when you read, note taking when you're looking at research articles, right? Um, that's part of the breaking down things into smaller chunks. Um, those to-do lists and the planning lists. Think of them as not just writing a paper, but think of the tasks you need to do. Again, what that's doing is taking it out of your mental space. It's on a reliable notebook that you won't lose or computer. Most people do these things electronically, right? But then you know where to go next. So you don't have to then keep relying on your memory of what's going on. And lastly, I would say give yourself periodic check ins once a week with all of your classes. How's it going this week? And some of that's going to be stress. I hate that class. Oh, it's so boring. Those readings are horrible. Let yourself feel all that stuff. And then think, okay, how did I do this week? What worked for me this week? What worked for me? And why might it have worked? And it's not like deep analysis, right? You could say, like, well, I got enough sleep. And when I read the readings, I had an idea of what the teacher might ask us. And so I was prepared. That might be one of the things that worked in your class that day. It could be something as simple as, I took good notes during the reading and during the lecture. So all I got to do is just glance over those notes again. Okay, that worked well for you. But periodic check ins about what worked well in each of your classes. Because one of the things that you're trying to do as a student is you're trying to figure out processes that work for you. And some of them are going to be the teacher's advice, and some of it's going to be the stuff we've said, and some of it's going to be your own thing that you come up with. And it's like, nope, it's music. It is listening to classical music when I write, whatever. Do periodic check-ins about what's working for you, because what you're really trying to get out of a college education isn't just a bunch of ideas and stuff, but to figure out what kind of learner you are, or to figure out what you need to do to make it easier for you to thrive. What are the steps and processes that make it easier for you to be successful? That's kind of what you're trying to do. The stuff you learn, you'll eventually forget a lot of it.
Yeah.
Just fine.
Well, fair enough. That seems as good a place to end as any. So again, Kenny Fountain, thank you very much.
And thank you for
Really
having me. It
appreciate
was
the
fun.
time. You've just finished an episode of Things that First Year Writers Need to Hear. If you enjoyed it, consider subscribing. It'd help this reach more people. And check out another episode if you want, or maybe something a bit shorter if you'd prefer.